Hello and welcome to today's Imparta webinar, Sales Training Reimagined, Save Time, Money and Motivate Your Sales Teams. My name's Jocelyn, I'm your organiser for today, and I just want to cover a few housekeeping items before we get into the webinar. So firstly, we will be making the recording available and also a copy of the slide deck in an email after the webinar. And the recording shall also be archived on imparta.com. So if you want to share it at a later date, please feel free to do so. We'd love to hear from you throughout the webinar, so if you have any questions, please enter them into the questions pane on the right-hand side. Stay connected to today's webinar via social media by using the Twitter handle @Imparta. The webinar will be in full screen mode today, but if you'd like to ask any questions, you shall be able to locate this in the green control panel at the top of the screen. Lastly, I'd love to hand over to your host for today. Your host is Richard Barkey, CEO of Imparta. He founded Imparta in 1997, was formerly at McKinsey & Co., where he spent 4 years as a management consultant, and then 3 years pioneering the use of simulation-based training. Having grown Imparta to be recognized in the global top 20 sales training companies 6 years in a row, Richard remains closely involved in learning design as well as taking overall responsibility for the direction of the business. Richard also holds an MA in engineering and an MBA with distinction from the Harvard Business School. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Joss. And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. The topic of the webinar, as you know, is Sales Training Reimagined. And I think with the amount of uncertainty in the world at the moment, it's not a bad time to step back and think, are there better ways that we can achieve the results that we want to achieve with our sales teams? So for those who are not familiar with Imparta, I'm just going to say just a couple of words on who we are. Imparta is a global business that operates in 3 major content areas: sales, marketing, and customer service. And those are the 3 primary customer-facing parts of the organization, which is what ties them together. We also do quite a lot of work in leadership to support those functional areas. And at the heart of our company is something called the capability building system, which is if you like, a thin change wrapper, a modular toolkit that sits around training to make sure that it sticks and has impact. I'll come back to talk a little bit more about that model and the way it kind of sheds light on sales academies in a short while. But as I said, the topic is Sales Training Reimagined. And if I asked you to step back and think about sales training from your point of view, I imagine you'd probably come up with a few things like this. So you imagine a large number of people in a room, probably with some kind of facilitator, and that may well be something that takes a few days out of people's diary. It is relatively often a 2 or 3 day process to go through sales training, and it's expensive. So there are the fees to external providers, there are the costs for accommodation and transport, and also the time off the road has an opportunity cost, of course, for the people attending. So there are issues with sales training, but equally, if you think about the kind of the main current alternative, which is sales e-learning, what springs to mind there may be similarly a mixed bag. So you'll think about people doing learning on their laptop or perhaps tablet or even phone, but quite often being distracted by anything from emails coming in to election results popping up on their screen. The process they go through with the learning will start with typically a fairly dense piece of theory, often in the form of effectively a narrated PowerPoint slide with some brief exercises in between. And then at the end, there'll be some kind of quiz or test to make sure that people have understood the content. So e-learning itself is attractive primarily because it's considerably less expensive. Now, we did a research study with trainingindustry.com in the States that covered 235 organizations. And what we found was that 71% of those organizations believed that cost savings were indeed a benefit of using e-learning to deliver sales training. About half of those respondents felt that salespeople preferred e-learning over traditional approaches to training. But only a third believed that sales training via e-learning is very effective compared to the face-to-face alternative. So here's the dichotomy between, on the one side, a significant potential cost saving from using e-learning for sales training, and on the other hand, a relatively low perception of its effectiveness as a learning tool. So how do we square the circle? Well, before I go to that, I'd like to just ask you to kind of think about your current sales training challenges. So I've set out a few there with cost and effectiveness. But in a second, I'm going to ask the team to put up a poll that will just ask you just a few example challenges that you may be having in your organization or your clients' organizations if you're a consultant around sales training. So if we could just show the poll and ask you to just choose aligning stakeholders, making the training stick, reducing cost, tailoring the content to your environment or the client's environment, and achieving and measuring impact. You can choose any of these. You can have more than one response. So we'll just give that a few seconds to run through. Okay, so if we could show the results, please. So what you can see here is that the majority of people, or the most significant challenge, is achieving and measuring impact, which is not surprising from our experience. Making the training stick second, then reducing cost. So that kind of trade-off between cost and effectiveness and impact and stickability does seem indeed to be something that, as a group, the people on this call are experiencing as well. So one way of perhaps shedding some light on that is by trying to plot different approaches to sales training on a matrix of costs along the bottom and effectiveness up the y-axis of this graph. So the first entry I'd point to is traditional sales e-learning, which is relatively low cost, particularly if it's bought in bulk as part of a library of e-learning content. Relatively low effectiveness in skill building. E-learning can, in its kind of current form, be very effective as a way of transferring knowledge, but generally less effective at building replicable, sustainable skills. Moving along to the right and up in effectiveness, we have traditional face-to-face sales training that can be pretty effective, can also be very expensive, but its effectiveness is limited perhaps by the lack of stickability, going back to the poll responses. So the kind of current best practice solution to that is a sales academy or a sales excellence program, many different terms, for something that is basically about embedding training in a multi-year program that covers how we do business around here and goes beyond the single training intervention to encompass manager coaching, reinforcement, measurement, and so on. So sales academies can be very effective, and they can be more expensive, although not massively more expensive than traditional training to run. But if you then move to the left, what we're positing with this webinar and with the launch of the Imparta Virtual Sales Academy is that digital sales academies can actually automate and digitize a significant proportion of the work that's currently manual in a sales academy, both in terms of the training, but also in the management and the change management of the academy process. So that for, ideally, for kind of a bit less cost than a traditional sales e-learning approach, you can have significantly more effectiveness and get above that value equivalence line, as you can see here. So for the rest of the webinar, I'm going to talk about some generalizable lessons for digital sales academies. I will refer to our Virtual Sales Academy product primarily as an example and as an illustration of how these things can work, but I'm aware, of course, that people join webinars not just to hear about a product launch, so I'm going to talk about some of the general lessons primarily. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is best practices in digital sales training and how you can avoid some of the common pitfalls that waste time and money. The second is, interestingly, to cover how you empower managers and how you energize an increasingly millennial sales audience? I'm sure many of you have tackled that issue and have made progress with it already, but can we push that a little bit further? Thirdly, how can you transfer, as I've talked about, the best components of real-world sales academies into the digital domain? And finally, we'll talk about Cisco as an example. We've worked very closely with Cisco for the last couple of years, reimagining sales training for their global virtual sales and customer success organization. So we'll start then with that first topic, which is best practices in digital sales training and how to avoid the common pitfalls that waste time and money. Many of you will be familiar with David Kolb's work and the learning cycle that he helped to define that really describes the way that adults learn through a process of experience and reflection. And the learning cycle, I think, is a very good place to start when you're talking about the effectiveness of e-learning and where it can be improved. Learning starts often with experience. So up in the top right-hand segment there, we have a new experience. It could be a simulation or a role play or even a real customer interaction. And that creates a degree of positive anxiety, some tension that motivates us to improve. That's followed often by a process of reflection where we think about how well we've performed using some kind of feedback, and we know a bit where we need to improve. And then by abstract conceptualization, which is a long way of saying we think about the theory and how things might be made better. So this in traditional e-learning is where we're given tools and theory that help us to think about how we improve our skills. And finally, there's a process of experimentation where people practice applying a skill and adapt the approach to new situations. So this is the theory, if you like, behind adult learning. Again, many of you will be familiar. And just to illustrate the example, if, let's say I stick my finger into a candle flame in experience and it hurts, I might reflect on that and go, I don't want to do that again. The abstract conceptualization might be, I might have a couple of theories that, bright things hurt or flames hurt, and I might test that through experimentation and figure out that if I move my finger through the flame very quickly, it doesn't hurt too much. So a very simple example, but shows how that kind of skill or understanding evolves through the Kolb process. Now, if I were to plot the way that most e-learning works onto that Kolb learning cycle, we start to get some insight into why it's not terribly effective for skill building. So the way most e-learning and sales training works is typically we'll begin by explaining the learning objectives of a particular section, and then we'll show people some theory, again, often using in one form or another, videos or animated PowerPoint slides, that kind of thing. And then finally, we'll ask quiz questions and reflect on the answers. And that's basically going backwards around the cycle. So we're starting in abstract conceptualization by giving theory first, and then we're following up with the reflection process. Now that has two issues. One, as I said, is going backwards around the learning cycle, and secondly, it's kind of missing out to a large extent experience and experimentation. Now, in many cases, those of you who are familiar with the 70-20-10 approach, which kind of doesn't say you shouldn't do formal learning, but says 70% of your learning is often informal and on the job, the experimentation and the experience can take place outside the remit of the learning process. But if you're not welding that into the experience and the learning, then it's less effective as part of that learning process. The other issue is that we often, especially with e-learning, will offer a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to training and sales. It tends to be more fire and forget, so here it is, go through it, we'll check if you've done it, but there's little reinforcement and follow-up, and there's often limited manager involvement in that process. So that's why a lot of sales e-learning is relatively ineffective, or one of the reasons anyway. How can one, in a general sense, not talking about the Virtual Sales Academy at this point, but in a general sense, how could you make sales e-learning work given that framework? So I think the first thing is you begin at the beginning. You start by creating in a module around a particular skill some kind of experience. So that might be using a simulation, a computer simulation, or even a real-world simulation like a virtual case study, or an actual real-world situation where you bring in an account team or an opportunity chase team to talk about their experience and what's going on. Then you offer some kind of reflection. So that might be online coaching or feedback from managers or the feedback that's built into an online simulation, and perhaps provide an opportunity for peer-to-peer discussion to reflect as a group on the experience. Then moving into abstract conceptualization, you can bring in at that point some of the more traditional approaches to sales e-learning. Ideally, it would adapt itself to what people need based on the output from the second stage. But even if it doesn't, that's where the e-learning could perhaps be most useful. And again, in an ideal world, it would cover not just the skills, but how those skills apply with your particular set of products and services. And then finally, in the experimentation phase, this is where you can use tools to stimulate virtual group work, on-the-job activities, or even to have role plays taking place with the manager. And at the bottom, you'll see, looking at the whole package, ideally this would be a modular approach and wrapped into a simple change process that helps to make it stick. So when we started working with Cisco and started dreaming about the possibility of creating this virtual sales academy, I had the great fun and joy of taking a team away and going, if we were to build something that was genuinely the best e-learning in the world, what would it look like? And this was the kind of thinking that we were going through and saying, okay, so you'd want something that was experiential, that reflected, that was adaptive to that in terms of the theory it presented, and that allowed people to try again and practice and really reinforce their skills. So the way that we've implemented that, and it's something I'm personally very excited and proud of, looks a bit like this. So in the first segment, the experience segment, we offer a scene setter to raise tension and excitement about a particular issue or skill. So if you're covering, let's say, how to win a competitive pitch, you kind of get a view behind the scenes to see the procurement person at the client talking to the team who's going to be making the decision. And then we put people into a simulation, a micro simulation that lasts typically 10 to 15 minutes to see how they do using their intuitive skills without any theory. We then give them very detailed feedback and get them to reflect on what they've done well and badly, and use videos that might be, for example, the voice of the customer, so customers talking about their experience of being sold to help people to reflect on what it's like being a customer in those situations. And at that point, we then move across to the abstract conceptualization piece and provide the theory that adapts itself to what people have done well and poorly in the simulation, with little mini exercises to consolidate understanding, but basically it's about getting people to understand how you might approach these situations differently. And then we put people back into the simulation, the same one, but this time with perhaps a tool or two added in to help them. And we allow them to do it again, and hopefully to do much better the second time. They get given feedback again, and we have different versions of this that allow people to progress even if they haven't done very well, or that make sure they've got it before they move forward. And then we give people role plays, tools, and on-the-job activities. I'll come back to the role plays in a second, to carry on that experimentation back in the field. And those tools can be PowerPoint-based, they can be Excel-based, they're available embedded into CRM systems and so on. So you can see how e-learning can start to kind of, within a module of learning, really take people around that that kind of experiential process, and it does actually work really, really well. That's embedded in a journey, and I think there are multiple ways that people can learn and improve their sales skills, but I'm talking for now about a course, if you like, a learning journey, such as in a major change program to improve skills or an induction program for new salespeople. So this is the Cisco journey, and it began with what we called an engage session. There was a personal assessment where people went through a process of quiz answering and some 180 assessment of skills that helped them to prioritize where they needed to focus in the journey ahead. They then, the system sets up a meeting with their manager to go through a learning plan and a personal development plan. And then there are a number of modules that they go through that combine sales skills, both at the kind of what we call the network layer, the interpersonal skills layer, the more kind of advanced selling skills like building awareness of needs or competing in the assessment of alternatives. And those are interwoven with product training that links back to the sales skills and shows people how to apply those skills in a particular context. And at the end of each phase, there's a gate. You can see the kind of golden banners. That is a role play that, again, the system sets up and curates with the manager that allows people to practice those skills that they've learned in that section on the phone in a controlled environment with the manager. And the results of that are fed back into their competency score in the system. And they can then go and dig down into that competency and find more activities to do if there's an area where they're slightly weaker. So that kind of integration of the managers through the personal learning planning and the role plays was almost an unexpected benefit, actually, of the system, and the level of engagement and confidence that the managers have when they're in this kind of a process is extremely interesting and very high. So all of that content, we draw on a modular curriculum. So we have a way of describing the sales world, if you like, that starts with foundation level skills, moves on to core skills around opportunity management, extends that, if necessary, to negotiation, commercial acumen, strategic account management, and then up to the management and leadership levels. And each of those courses is made up of typically 8 to 10 of these kind of playing cards, which each one represents a module of about 1 to 1.5 hours of e-learning, a tool, competencies, on-the-job activities, et cetera, et cetera. So that course journey I've just described can be tailored depending on the needs of the organization or the individuals. So that's kind of how e-learning can avoid some of the pitfalls of not being effective. Let's talk now a bit more in detail about managers and in particular this millennial challenge that many of us face. So here's an example of how not to empower managers. You tell the manager that we're training your people. You don't need to be involved. It's fine. It's a central initiative, and you just need to make sure we know who of your team needs to go on the training. We'll tell you who's done what in the e-learning, so you get kind of a report on usage or completion or who's logged in, so that you can chase people who haven't done it. And we would like to ask you what your people need, but actually there's no point because everybody gets the same thing. So that's how not to empower managers. To flip that over, how I think one can empower managers in this kind of environment in sales e-learning is by creating a context for their support and for ongoing coaching. So giving the managers a clear briefing on the process and the payoff, both at the individual and the organization level from the training, giving them a short version of the team's learning. We would ideally like managers to spend more time doing training than the people they're supposed to be coaching, but often that's hard to do culturally and practically. So at the very least, we'd like to give people who are in a management role a good understanding of the concepts and the skills that their team is being asked to learn, and also provide them with data and a structure for doing that development planning with the individuals on their team. So here's where John or Julie are strong or weak, and here's how to think about how you engage with them to build their skills. Offering managers a refresher in coaching skills. Many managers know coaching pretty well, but some don't, and some don't use it even if they know what it is. So offering some kind of refresher around coaching is valuable. And as I discussed earlier, putting in place some kind of structured assessment or role play to give managers almost an easy way to get involved with their team that makes them look good and makes them feel confident. And then the on-the-job activities that they take away and work on with their team members that help them to make sure the team members are really applying those skills in the field. So that's how I think you can empower managers, and I'm sure there are others that you could think of. And the good news is that much of that can be automated in a virtual academy. So if that's the managers, let's turn to millennials. And millennials are a much kind of discussed group of people, probably one of the most dissected groups of people we've seen, actually. And what I've picked out here is just 6 characteristics that are generally accepted to be true for millennials, and talk about how you can, again, from a general point of view, design and select e-learning that will appeal to them. And of course, these are also the things that we've used in trying to design the Virtual Sales Academy to appeal to millennials. So the first thing is millennials tend to visualize things. They tend to be more visual than other groups of the population. So making use of diagrams and tools and animations as well as words is critical. The one thing I would say as a caution here is I've seen quite a lot of e-learning where the visuals are basically window dressing. They're there to make something pretty rather than to help understanding. So using visuals as we've done here as kind of iconic reminders or reinforcers of the message is a much more powerful way to use the visual tools. Play. So we know that millennials like games, not just millennials, but using forms of gamification where you get kind of competition going between people within a cohort going through training, finding ways to make training new and to make it fun. Again, the caveat here, I think, is avoiding games for the sake of it. So the kind of game where you do some product training, and if you get the quiz right, you get to play a shoot 'em up for 3 minutes as a reward, isn't for me really gamification in learning. Gamification is where like simulations, where the game is the learning itself, it's integrated and part of it. The third thing, millennials are free birds. They tend to prefer to be self-guided. So making sure that you have some form of assessment of skill, whether it's a quiz or a self-assessment of competency or a 180-degree assessment or whatever, that allows people to then guide their own learning, will tend to appeal more to millennials than something that's not modular and is a great big kind of monolithic chunk of content for them to go through. Millennials are not great planners, and so allowing flexibility in how to access the content on the spur of the moment, so multiple formats, mobile and tablet versions, the ability to download and run when you're offline, and so on is critical. They also tend to seek clarity and context, so this isn't a VSA-specific thing, but generally explaining the content and the payoff, sorry, the context rather, and the payoff of any training you're doing with millennials early and often, repeating it often is useful. And finally, millennials, I think, can be described as generation coach. They're extremely hungry for coaching. And so trying to provide coaching in multiple formats, whether that be virtual coaching in a simulation, or real coaching that's face-to-face with the manager, or asynchronous online, synchronous online coaching where the manager's there but on the end of a phone or the end of a WebEx connection. But either way, managers are critical in making that kind of connection with the millennial audience. So I'm sure that many of you will have thought about millennials and come up with your own approaches to appealing to them. And some of these are relatively obvious, like the visual thing, but many of these are actually harder to do than they are to say. So making sure that something is self-guided, flexible, fun, novel, and provides multiple coaching opportunities is critical to engaging that group of people. So moving on, just to talk about how we transfer the best components of real-world sales academies into the digital world, the digital domain. And I have another poll question for you here. This is a statue of Socrates from the Academy in Athens, and it's sort of there to remind us that an academy is not a new concept. But if I asked you what academy elements you use beyond training itself, and I've not listed the kind of 20 or 30 things that we could ask you about here, but I've just picked 5 examples again. So if we could show the poll. So I'd just ask you again, multiple choice, any of these that you use. Application tools, for example, built into your CRM system or sitting standalone in PowerPoint or whatever. Manager coaching, application sessions and deal clinics, measurement of both competency, for those of you who are familiar with Kirkpatrick, level 3, Kirkpatrick measure, or impact, which is of course level 4, or even campaigns, learning campaigns that are focused on the strategic objectives of your organization. Which of these do you use? And I'll just give you a second to fill that out. Fantastic. Okay, so if we could show the results, please. bear me a second. Okay, I'm not sure if you guys can see the results. I can, so I'll talk through them. Okay, they're up now, good. So most people can use coaching by managers, which is great, and I think that's a message that's come across strongly over the last few years. A fair amount of measurement of competency and impact, which is also very encouraging. Also relatively high use of application tools, surprisingly high use of campaigns around strategic objectives, actually, that's good. Less application session and deal clinics. I'll talk a bit more about that perhaps in a minute. But overall, there's none of these that everybody uses, and I think what's interesting is there are multiple approaches that you can use that are not necessarily kind of great big projects, but are just clever, lean approaches to achieving real impact with training. So if we could close the poll, I will just move to give you a framework to think about this. I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, our capability building system. And the connect phase is the first part of this, and it's really about creating a vision for change and connecting the sales team, in this case, to that vision. Then we move into engage, where we engage people in that change. We gamify, we plan learning with the managers, we do assessments to create a baseline for where people are and build a felt need to improve. Then there's the develop stage, which is the training piece, developing skills through, as we've discussed, experiential learning, manager role plays, and so on. And then the stick bit, which is in many ways the most interesting, how you make things stick through ongoing coaching, through on-the-job activities, through embedding tools in the CRM system or in the learning, and so on. And then finally, measure, which in itself is a key part of stick, of course, measuring both knowledge and skill and impact, and importantly, celebrating success when you achieve it. So that's kind of an overall structure, and it may be interesting perhaps, and these slides will be available after, to think through what you currently do within your organization around some of those topics. But the question is, how much of that can you virtualize? So this is how we think about this in a virtual sales academy. So creating a vision and connecting people to it is to a large extent about communication, and you can use animations and other videos, other forms of communication to do that. We're actually working on, it's in our kind of development pipeline for the next few months, a system that would allow us to basically survey people once they've seen that kind of communication and ask them how they feel about it, and provide a live change readiness map for the organization where you can see kind of where people are in terms of their skill and will, if you like, in terms of the change that's being proposed, which I think will be very interesting. Within Engage, this is where the Virtual Sales Academy itself comes up. So within that, you can see on that little diagram a leaderboard in the bottom middle, for example, that shows how people stand against their peers in performance on the various simulation tasks, which gets people to go back and try again, and there's that kind of desire to improve your performance that gamers around the world are very familiar with. Developing skills through experiential learning, the simulations we talked about, and the curated role plays with the manager. Making it stick, what you can see there is a tool that's embedded in a CRM system, in any CRM system actually. And then finally on the measure piece, the system will create a radar plot of different competencies. This is a very complex one for a very senior group. And you can see there some of the competencies are completed through role plays and some are pending input from the manager. But that provides a very personal approach to where my skills are and where I need to improve. So the good news is we can automate and digitize a lot of what happens in a sales academy. But it's worth also mentioning that there are multiple ways that you need to provide access to content, I think, in a sales academy. So the most obvious one is the course at the top here. So for example, providing training for all account managers in your organization, or all salespeople, and so on. There's also the competency route into a particular module. So that is where, for example, you need to develop somebody who's in an existing role and not everybody has the same skill gaps, but you can allow people to do the assessment, and that could be multiple ways of doing it through quiz results, role plays, or a 180 or 360 degree assessment. Let them drill into that competency model and do courses or modules to improve that particular competency. Also very useful if you're preparing somebody for a transition to a new role. Then moving around this model, at the bottom we have context, where you're providing people with context-specific support in a particular job or task. So, for example, I'm planning a segment approach or trying to win a deal. So here we can allow a task-supported access to the content with a bit of artificial intelligence light to help people find the right stuff to look at that will help them with a particular context or task. And then finally, on the left-hand side, more of the campaign approach, where you might be using the same learning, but this time you're wrapping it in communication around a particular challenge. So it might be a new competitor or a product launch, and you kind of trying to create buzz around what can be done and do a deep dive on one particular skill rather than digging into or sort of blanketing the whole skill set. So I think the lesson from this is there are multiple ways to access the content in any sales training. Most learning management systems and most learning content management systems are relatively focused on the top and possibly the bottom of these, and trying to find ways to enable that kind of multiple access and ongoing usage of the content is something that we've put a lot of priority into our cloud-based system. It is worth saying, though, I think that face-to-face still has a key role to play. So the great thing about a very effective digital sales academy is that you cover off some of the core skill building in a very efficient and now very effective way. And we use an analogy from martial arts where in karate, for example, you talk about kata and bunkai. So the kata is the kind of exercise, the practice. It's a set form of moves where you learn the theory, the concepts, the tools, and the techniques. And that's kind of what the Virtual Sales Academy provides. Bunkai is where you apply those in a kind of limited setting in martial arts, in a contact fight. The equivalent for that in sales training is really in applying those skills to real situations in a coached format. So quite often we'll run the kata, being the Virtual Sales Academy, and then we'll run bunkai sessions with one of our facilitators, or indeed a trained-up facilitator from our client, to help people to just make sure they can apply those skills and do deal coaching or account clinics to really make progress on major deals. And I've seen fabulous results from that. I mean, there was one account where one client of ours where I was involved in 5 of these sessions, and adding up the deals that were ultimately won, it came to something like £150 million worth of total contract value. So, you know, the stakes can be pretty high here. So finally today, and I will pause for some questions at the end of this, I'm just going to talk very quickly about Cisco's experience. We had an event at the Ivy restaurant recently where Cisco themselves came along and talked about this. So we didn't want to ask them to do every webinar that we're doing, but I've got permission from them to use some of their slides just to talk about the experience they had with the Virtual Sales Academy. So there are multiple applications of VSA. The first one is just simply establishing a common sales approach. The second is adding modular elements to an existing sales academy, whether that's new content that wasn't there before or additional reinforcement tools. The third is reducing the cost of sales training. The fourth is potentially creating best-in-class sales induction programs. And it was those 3 and 4 that are highlighted that Cisco were particularly focused on. We have other clients who look at this for precision development of existing teams, so this kind of personally tailored learning plan based on your competency assessment, and indeed for reaching new audiences at a low cost. So in fact, Cisco are now looking at this, moving from training their own people to training channel partners in sales training. Also very effective for reaching out to support staff who, like technical sales, who maybe were too many to include in the formal face-to-face sales training you might have done in the past. But Cisco were looking to reduce the cost of their induction program and to bring it up to being best in class. So this is the challenge that they described themselves as facing when we started working with them some 18 months, I think, ago it was. Very fast-growing organization, geographically dispersed, so they were doing WebEx-based induction training that was some 50 or 60 hours of WebEx training that was often at very anti-social times for some people around the world. It was very expensive to run and pretty hard to keep the content up to date because there was so much of it and it was all delivered by this kind of group of contract trainers. And wasn't really seen as living up to their HR promise, which is changing the way we live, work, play, and learn. So they wanted to find something that really did kind of live up to that promise. The vision of what they wanted, and forgive the kind of icons here, but was basically something that was agile and modern, hence the cheetah, something that combined and linked not just how to sell, but what we sell, in other words, the product training linked to the sales skills, and where we sell it, so talking also about the channel environment in which people work. Excuse me. And finally, on the right-hand side, the time aspect is something that was very quick to deliver return on investment. Anybody on the call who's been involved in induction programs will be, especially in sales, will be aware that the quicker you get people up to speed and the sooner they generate revenue, that has a very significant impact on their profit impact in the first year after you hire them. So that was a key takeaway. And generally, you know, as a state-of-the-art company, Cisco wanted something that that felt state-of-the-art as well. So I was thrilled that Cisco, after a fairly extensive research and a long decision process, chose us to work with. And they were looking for somebody who had a good understanding of, or a deep understanding of sales methodologies as well as learning technology, and who was willing to kind of try and push the art of the possible and create literally the best possible e-learning. So what they have said that they particularly like is, on the left-hand side, the methodology that underpins the Virtual Sales Academy, so the buying cycle, and I won't go through this in detail right now, but it underpins the way that we think about selling, and it's about really understanding and facilitating and adding value to the decision process that customers go through rather than thinking about your sales agenda. So all of the modules, and there's some 50 hours of sales training and about 80 hours in total if you include their product training. So there's a lot of content here. Not everybody has to go through everything, but that all fits around that buying cycle. So how do you build momentum in the awareness of needs phase? How do you beat the competition in the assessment of alternatives? How do you uncover and alleviate risks? How do you ensure the decision is made? And how do you make sure that customers and clients achieve the results you've promised them? So that was key for Cisco. But also the different simulations you can see there, allowing people to practice selling Cisco products and services in a real kind of Cisco context. So the simulations can be tailored, or they can be off the shelf. Generally, they're off the shelf, but the Cisco ones were tailored to be their products and services in their world. And then finally, on the right-hand side, that rather debonair-looking chap there is there to indicate the way that managers were integrated into the academy and were involved. Triggering coaching and mentoring was critical for new hires and something that Cisco were very, very pleased about. In terms of results, they themselves think that they will save over $1 million over 3 years just by saving the costs of trainers and travel for the bits that were done in person. That was why they started down this route, was to reduce cost. They were, I think, themselves somewhat surprised that they actually now have something that's much better quality and more consistent than traditional. I'm not saying, by the way, through all of this, that face-to-face training no longer has a place. We at Imparta do a great deal of face-to-face training, and there are situations where it's still by far the best approach. But what the VSA does is offer a credible alternative and allow you to use the trainers and use the face-to-face piece, not to do the basic level training, but to then take people to a much more advanced level in these application sessions. So reduced cost, improved quality, I think. Competitive advantage, so Cisco believe that their new hires are hitting the ground running much more quickly and with much more confidence and generating revenue many months sooner than they would have done. And also linking the sales training to the product training is very effective. And staff motivation, I think one can't underestimate this. So over 85% believe they acquired directly applicable skills, and the millennial audience, which this primarily is for Cisco, got a significant buzz, and it became actually a recruiting tool in saying that this is the kind of induction we can offer. And finally, but not least, managers feeling empowered and connected to their teams was seen as a really significant benefit. So we've talked about quite a lot in the last sort of 45 minutes. We've covered the things that e-learning does wrong from the experiential learning point of view, and how e-learning can be used to get that bit right, so we can have both the reduced costs and the improved effectiveness of e-learning. We've talked about how to bring in managers and appeal to millennials, and we've also talked about the kind of the Cisco example and how you can digitize some of the face-to-face elements of a sales academy. So at that point, I'd like to pause and ask if there are any questions from the group. If you would like to type those questions into the pane, if you haven't done that already, then it would be my pleasure to answer any questions you have.
Thanks, Richard. That's great. We have had a few questions and some interesting ones as well that quite closely relate to what you've been talking about. So the first one comes from Chloe, and it sort of relates to the second poll you did. A lot of people did say that they use coaching by managers, but if you don't have a coaching culture among sales managers, is the Virtual Sales Academy still effective?
Okay, thank you. So if you don't have a coaching culture, is the Virtual Sales Academy still effective? So I think the answer is, obviously I would say this is yes, and in two ways. So one, I think if you don't have a coaching culture, it's arguable that you probably would be doing better if you did have one, and therefore providing a structured way for managers to do coaching of their teams is a good way to get that culture going, because it's one thing to train people, and there are modules available on coaching with simulations for managers to practice coaching. So that's one thing. You can use this to train managers in coaching, but also it's getting people to apply that and experience that coaching can work really, really well, both in the curated role plays and in the kind of application sessions, the bunkai sessions. So I think VSA can be used to build a coaching culture. If you had a group of managers who said, no, we're not going to get involved, everything's relative. So I guess putting people through experiential learning rather than just having them talked at in a classroom would still be better than nothing. Although I'd have to say that in my experience, getting managers from the very top down to first-line managers involved and supporting this kind of initiative is pretty key, because the risk otherwise is that, obviously people go on training and they come back and the manager goes, anyway, back to where we were, and it's all lost very quickly. So I think the answer is yes. However, if you don't have a manager coaching culture, I think that probably begs a bigger question. I hope that helps.
Okay. And another one from James. So, will experienced salespeople gain any benefit from going through the academy, or is this for just more junior salespeople, as you sort of discussed?
Okay, thank you, James. So, yes, I think clearly with Cisco, they used this as an induction program for people who came partly very experienced people, partly new and quite young people. So it was a mixture of people in that situation. But VSA is also used for training very experienced people. You would probably use it slightly differently. So I talked earlier about there being modular content, and some of the modules on the basics of selling, like interpersonal skills, rapport building, sophisticated questioning, all of those kinds of things, you probably might not want to offer to people of a more senior level. But there are skills that any level of salesperson needs to constantly refine. So the ability to probe for needs, to bring insight to the customer conversation, to build strategies to beat competitors. That's things that everybody can benefit from practicing. And what we find is the simulation-based approach, because people are given the opportunity to show what they can do first, and then they're only given the theory that they need to get better, actually works really, really well for senior people, because they don't feel patronized or talked down to. They can kind of show their stuff, and then quite often they discover they weren't quite as good as they thought they were. But if they were, then the system just goes, well, that's great, off you go, and good luck with the next bit. So yes, I think so. And the other thing I'd mention is the multiple kind of use cases I talked about earlier. So you might have a system, a course being put on for everybody where they go through the same content, but you might also use this in a format that said, do an assessment and then just focus on the learning that covers the skill gaps that you demonstrated in that assessment or that you've agreed with your manager. So I think the answer to your question, James, is yes, you would. Senior people will benefit, as well as junior people, that you just might deploy it in a slightly different way. And the same, I think, goes for any other sales e-learning that you have. You just need to think about how you would deploy for a more senior group that's different and more tailored to what they need than you would for a more junior group.
Thanks for that, Richard. So we're running out of time a little bit because we've just got a few closing comments. But for the last question from Erica, is it realistic to expect salespeople to study effectively online when they always have other priorities?
Yeah, so I think with a lot of e-learning, there are two barriers. The first barrier is getting people to start it, and the second, and probably more significant barrier, is getting people to finish it. So what we found with the Virtual Sales Academy is that completion rates, both starting and completion rates, are basically around about 100%, and that's a fairly extraordinary figure compared to what one would typically see for e-learning. And that is for a range of different types of salespeople. So why is that? Well, I think it's because, as I said earlier, it follows the Kolb learning cycle. So those of you who've deployed e-learning within your own organizations will probably have similar experiences. If you've got something that's kind of narrated PowerPoint with some quiz questions, you may find that take-up is a bit sluggish, and getting people to finish things is tricky. But if you have learning that genuinely engages people and they genuinely feel is giving them a payoff, then people find time, and because it's online, they don't have to do it during work hours. People were doing it, in the evening, in the early mornings, in lunchtimes. So I think if you get the learning right, and if you appeal in the right way to salespeople through competition, through being visual, and all the things I've talked about, then I do think that salespeople will make time within their schedule to do it, and that has been our kind of experience in practice.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all of that. So some really interesting insights today. If you have any further questions or requests, we've left some details on the last slide, Richard's actual email address. You can always keep up to date with us through our social channels. As I said earlier, our Twitter handle is @Imparta, and you can find our listing on LinkedIn as Imparta. One of the subjects that Richard discussed today is a very exciting new Virtual Sales Academy that can be found at www.imparta.com/TIVSA, TIVSA. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording and all of the slides, but I just want to thank, first of all, Richard for the very interesting webinar today, and you for joining and participating. Thank you.